Chapter 1: The Goalkeeper. David Vaughan Icke was born on April 29, 1952, in Leicester, England, into a working-class family that valued steady work and quiet endurance. His father labored in a factory, and by Icke's own recollection, he grew up feeling slightly out of step with the world around him. He has often described himself as a sensitive child, observant and inward, carrying the persistent sense that reality had layers most people did not notice. Whether that memory is shaped by hindsight or genuine temperament is impossible to know, but it forms the first thread in a story that would eventually stretch into cosmic proportions. As a teenager, football became his focus. Icke trained as a goalkeeper and showed enough promise to join Coventry City's youth system in the late 1960s. Goalkeeping is a lonely position. The goalkeeper stands apart from the team, watching patterns develop, anticipating catastrophe, knowing that a single misjudgment can define the match. For a time, it appeared that Icke might build a professional career in the sport. Then rheumatoid arthritis intervened. The condition struck in his late teens, damaging his joints and ending any realistic hope of long-term professional play. The dream that had structured his young identity dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. After football, he turned to journalism. Beginning at the Leicester Advertiser, he moved steadily upward, transitioning into radio and then television. By the 1970s he was working for BBC Radio Leicester, and soon after for BBC Television. Calm and articulate on camera, Icke built a reputation as a sports presenter who combined clarity with confidence. In the 1980s he became a familiar face on BBC's Grandstand, covering major events including the 1986 World Cup. He interviewed athletes, narrated highlights, and delivered scores to millions. He was not an outsider at this stage. He was the establishment, or at least comfortably inside it. In 1981 he married and began raising a family. His life outwardly resembled that of many successful broadcasters of the era. Stable career. National platform. Recognizable face. Yet beneath that surface, his interests were shifting. By the late 1980s he had become deeply concerned about environmental degradation and political corruption. He joined the UK Green Party and rose quickly within its ranks, eventually serving as a national spokesperson. His speeches began to blend ecological alarm with broader critiques of corporate power and centralized authority. He spoke of systems behind systems, of structures that shaped visible politics from behind the scenes. It was during this period that Icke began describing experiences that felt to him like intuitive revelations. He has said that he felt guided, as if information was arriving fully formed rather than being constructed through research alone. In 1990 he met Betty Shine, a psychic healer who told him he possessed spiritual significance and was here to deliver important truths. Icke later described this meeting as catalytic. Soon after, he began to speak not merely about political reform but about hidden realities, unseen forces, and an approaching transformation of human consciousness. The sports presenter was becoming something else. This week on Strange, we begin with the ordinary man before the extraordinary claims, tracing how a BBC broadcaster and former goalkeeper stepped away from studio lights and into a worldview that would eventually include interdimensional reptiles, hidden bloodlines, and a cosmos engineered to control human perception. Chapter 2: The Awakening. By 1990, David Icke had already begun drifting away from the life that once defined him. He was still recognizable as a BBC sports presenter. He was still involved in politics through the Green Party. But his focus had shifted from environmental policy and electoral reform to something much larger and far less tangible. He would later describe this period as the beginning of an internal unraveling of consensus reality. The world, he felt, was not merely mismanaged. It was fundamentally misunderstood. The meeting that catalyzed this shift took place on the Isle of Wight with a psychic healer named Betty Shine. Shine claimed she could perceive colors and vibrations in people's energy fields. During their sessions, she told Icke that he had a profound spiritual role to play, that he was here to awaken humanity to hidden truths. She reportedly described him as a conduit for higher knowledge. For Icke, this was not flattery. It was confirmation. He has said that he left those meetings with the overwhelming sense that his life was about to change direction completely. Soon after, Icke began speaking about experiences he characterized as psychic communication. He described sudden insights arriving whole, as if transmitted rather than reasoned through. He spoke of sensing presences and of receiving information about humanity's spiritual suppression. The vocabulary of his public appearances shifted rapidly. Words like energy, consciousness, vibration, and destiny replaced the language of sports and even the language of party politics. What had begun as environmental activism was expanding into metaphysical revelation. In 1991, he made the now infamous appearance on the BBC programme Wogan. Seated across from host Terry Wogan, Icke spoke calmly about spiritual awakening and global change. He referred to himself as a son of the Godhead, a phrase that immediately landed with confusion. The studio audience reacted with laughter that was unmistakable and sustained. It was not hostile shouting. It was dismissal. For many viewers, it was a spectacle of eccentricity. For Icke, it was a line in the sand. The ridicule that followed was swift and relentless. British tabloids caricatured him. Former colleagues distanced themselves. His broadcasting career effectively ended. He became a cultural punchline in the United Kingdom, shorthand for public self-destruction. The social cost was real. Invitations vanished. Contracts dissolved. His reputation as a serious media figure collapsed. What is striking is not that the backlash occurred, but that it did not stop him. Icke interpreted the mockery as evidence that powerful forces use ridicule as a defense mechanism against uncomfortable truths. If he was being laughed at, he reasoned, it was because he had stepped too close to something important. Rather than retreat, he accelerated. He began devoting himself entirely to researching what he believed was the hidden structure of global power. Throughout the early 1990s, his writing intensified. The books grew longer and more complex. He began weaving together ancient mythologies, secret societies, alternative history, and modern geopolitics into a single explanatory framework. The awakening was no longer just about his personal transformation. It became a thesis about the nature of reality itself. Humanity, he argued, was asleep. Institutions were masks. History was curated. The laughter from that television studio did not end his public life. It transformed it. What began as a spiritual affirmation in a healer's room became a permanent departure from mainstream respectability. From that point forward, David Icke was no longer a broadcaster who believed unusual things. He was a man building an entirely new cosmology. Chapter 3: From Ridicule to Revelation. Public humiliation has a way of freezing a person in time. For many in Britain, David Icke remained permanently seated in that Wogan studio, bathed in audience laughter, reduced to a headline and a punchline. But outside the glare of that moment, something else was happening. Instead of retreating into obscurity, Icke began reconstructing himself. The ridicule did not silence him. It radicalized him. After his broadcasting career collapsed, Icke committed fully to research and writing. He traveled, lectured, and immersed himself in esoteric literature, conspiracy archives, alternative history texts, and ancient mythologies. He began drawing connections between disparate threads that had long circulated on the fringes of public discourse. Sumerian creation stories, Gnostic cosmology, the Illuminati mythos, the Federal Reserve, the British monarchy, intelligence agencies, banking dynasties. To Icke, these were not isolated subjects. They were fragments of a single hidden narrative. In 1994, he published The Robot's Rebellion, followed by And the Truth Shall Set You Free in 1995. It was in these works that the scaffolding of his now infamous worldview began to solidify. He argued that the world is controlled by a network of secret societies and bloodlines that operate above elected governments. Democracy, he suggested, was theater. Political parties were wings of the same structure. Media corporations functioned as narrative enforcement arms. The visible world, he wrote, was a surface illusion maintained by those who understood the deeper architecture. Then came the element that would define him permanently. The elite, Icke proposed, were not fully human. Drawing in part on the work of conspiracy theorists who wrote about ancient astronaut myths and Mesopotamian deities, Icke developed a theory that interdimensional reptilian beings had manipulated human genetics in antiquity. These beings, he claimed, created hybrid bloodlines that retained non-human traits. These bloodlines, he argued, became royal families, political dynasties, and financial elites. Power, in this framework, was not merely inherited socially. It was inherited biologically. He did not present this as metaphor. He presented it as literal. According to Icke, these reptilian entities exist beyond the visible frequency band of human perception. They can shapeshift between forms or project holographic disguises. Their agenda, he wrote, is control, emotional suppression, fear amplification, hierarchical domination. The ancient serpent myths found across cultures, he suggested, were distorted memories of this hidden species. It was a theory so extreme that many dismissed it instantly. Yet it also arrived during a decade of growing institutional distrust. The Cold War had ended, but secrecy remained. Scandals involving intelligence agencies and financial corruption continued to surface. The Internet was emerging, providing new pathways for alternative narratives to circulate without gatekeepers. Icke's lectures, often lasting for hours, began attracting audiences willing to entertain ideas once confined to mimeographed newsletters and late-night radio. His speaking style evolved. Calm, methodical, almost professorial. He layered claim upon claim, citation upon citation, weaving ancient texts with modern headlines. To supporters, this density felt persuasive. To critics, it felt like accumulation without verification. But the effect was undeniable. He was building not a single conspiracy theory, but a unified cosmology in which everything connected. Importantly, Icke positioned himself not as a guru demanding worship, but as someone urging independent thought. He repeatedly told audiences to question everything, including him. This rhetorical move strengthened his appeal. If you questioned him and still found coherence, you felt empowered rather than manipulated. The narrative became participatory. By the late 1990s, the laughter from 1991 no longer defined him internationally. Outside the United Kingdom, especially in North America and parts of Europe, he was becoming a cult figure in the literal sense of gathering a following. Massive books, marathon lectures, expanding mythos. The goalkeeper had become a mythmaker. What makes this transformation compelling is not whether one believes the claims. It is the scale of the construction. In less than a decade, David Icke moved from mainstream broadcaster to architect of one of the most elaborate conspiracy frameworks of the modern era. He did not merely add a new theory to the pile. He built a system that absorbed nearly every global event into a single, overarching explanation. And systems are powerful things. Because once someone steps inside them, the world begins to rearrange itself accordingly. Chapter 4: The Reptilian Bloodlines. By the mid-1990s, David Icke's worldview had hardened into a central claim that would define him permanently: the world is controlled by non-human entities operating through human bloodlines. This was not presented as allegory. It was not symbolic language about corruption or cold-blooded ambition. It was biological, interdimensional, and literal. According to Icke, ancient reptilian beings from another plane of existence had crossed into human reality thousands of years ago and altered the genetic trajectory of the species. To understand the architecture of this claim, one has to look at the sources Icke drew from. He cited ancient Mesopotamian myths about sky gods and serpent beings, particularly the Sumerian Anunnaki narratives that describe powerful entities descending from the heavens. He connected these myths to global serpent symbolism found in cultures across the world, from the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica to dragon lore in East Asia. Where historians see recurring archetypes, Icke saw fragmented memory. To him, These stories were distorted records of real encounters between humans and reptilian entities. The core of the theory is hybridization. Icke argues that these beings interbred with early human populations, creating bloodlines that retained certain non-human traits. These hybrid lines, he claims, became ruling classes, royal families, banking dynasties, intelligence networks, political elites. Power, in this framework, does not simply accumulate through wealth or military advantage. It is inherited through genetics that trace back to a non-human origin. One of the most controversial aspects of the theory involves the British royal family, whom Icke has repeatedly named as central examples of reptilian lineage. He has also referenced American presidents and global financial institutions as expressions of the same hidden bloodline network. The names shift depending on the lecture or book, but the structure remains constant. A small group of interrelated families maintain disproportionate influence over world events because they share ancestry that is not entirely human. Icke further claims that these reptilian entities exist primarily outside the narrow frequency band visible to human perception. In his model of reality, what we see is only a sliver of a much larger spectrum. The reptilians operate in adjacent dimensions and can project a human appearance into our visible range. This is where the shapeshifting claim enters. He has suggested that certain individuals can momentarily reveal their reptilian form, particularly under stress, and that rare witnesses have observed these transformations. Critics argue that such claims collapse under scientific scrutiny and rely on anecdotal testimony rather than empirical evidence. They also point out that narratives about secret bloodlines controlling finance and government have historically overlapped with dangerous conspiracy traditions. Icke has consistently denied anti-Semitic intent and insists that his theory concerns interdimensional bloodlines rather than ethnicity. Nonetheless, the proximity to older tropes has been a persistent source of controversy and condemnation. What makes the reptilian bloodline theory endure is not its biological plausibility but its explanatory reach. It provides a single, dramatic answer to the question of why power appears so concentrated and so resilient across generations. In a world where wealth inequality widens and political families recur, the idea of a hidden lineage offers narrative clarity. It replaces systemic complexity with species continuity. Within Icke's larger cosmology, the reptilians are not merely rulers. They are emotional predators. He has argued that they feed on low vibrational human states, particularly fear and conflict. Wars, economic collapse, social division, all become mechanisms for generating the emotional energy that sustains the controlling species. The world's turmoil is no longer accidental or purely political. It is agricultural. Humanity becomes livestock in a cosmic hierarchy. By placing non-human entities at the apex of global control, Icke transformed conspiracy theory into something mythic. It was no longer about secret meetings in back rooms. It was about ancient beings steering the arc of civilization itself. Whether viewed as delusion, metaphor run wild, or an elaborate modern mythology, the reptilian bloodline theory became the gravitational center of his work. Everything else would orbit it. Chapter 5: The Babylonian Brotherhood. If the reptilian bloodlines form the biological core of David Icke's worldview, the Babylonian Brotherhood is its organizational structure. This is the name Icke gives to the hidden network that coordinates global power across centuries. According to him, it is not a single institution but an interlocking web of secret societies, intelligence agencies, financial institutions, corporations, media conglomerates, and political dynasties. Governments change. Parties rotate. Leaders rise and fall. The Brotherhood remains. The term Babylonian is not accidental. Icke traces the origins of this control system back to ancient Babylon, which he describes as a cradle of occult knowledge and hierarchical governance. In his narrative, priesthoods and royal bloodlines in Mesopotamia developed esoteric techniques of control, embedding symbolic systems into religion, architecture, and ritual. These systems, he argues, were carried forward through secret traditions that eventually manifested in organizations such as the Knights Templar, certain branches of Freemasonry, and later elite policy groups. History, in this framework, is not a sequence of collapses and renaissances. It is a relay race of hidden authority. Icke frequently describes the Brotherhood as a pyramid. At the base are ordinary citizens, largely unaware of the forces shaping their lives. Above them sit layers of visible authority, local officials, national governments, corporate executives. Above that are international banking families, intelligence alliances, and transnational policy organizations. At the apex are the reptilian hybrid bloodlines, directing the system from a level almost entirely removed from public scrutiny. The structure is designed, he claims, to ensure plausible deniability at every tier. Those lower in the pyramid may not even know who ultimately benefits from their actions. Central banks play a crucial role in this architecture. Icke argues that control of money creation is the real lever of global dominance. By issuing currency as debt and manipulating interest rates, financial institutions can influence governments without appearing to rule them directly. Wars, he suggests, are often financed by interests on both sides, ensuring profit regardless of outcome. Economic crashes become strategic resets rather than unforeseen disasters. The visible chaos of markets conceals intentional choreography. Media institutions, in his view, function as narrative managers. Ownership consolidation allows a small number of corporations to shape the information landscape, determining which stories gain prominence and which fade. This does not require every journalist to be complicit, he argues. It requires only structural incentives and editorial boundaries that align with elite interests. The result is a range of acceptable opinion that feels broad but rarely challenges foundational power. One of Icke's most repeated phrases encapsulates this mechanism: problem, reaction, solution. The Brotherhood, he claims, creates or allows a crisis. The public reacts in fear or outrage. The same power structure then offers a solution that expands its authority. Terrorism leads to surveillance expansion. Financial instability leads to centralization. Health emergencies lead to emergency powers. Each event appears isolated. In his narrative, they are coordinated steps toward tighter global integration under a single governance model. The Babylonian Brotherhood theory transforms global politics into a theater production directed from behind the curtain. It reframes coincidence as design and complexity as camouflage. To supporters, this provides coherence in a world that often feels manipulated and opaque. To critics, it replaces nuanced institutional analysis with a monolithic villain that absorbs every outcome into its logic. Yet within Icke's cosmology, the Brotherhood is indispensable. Without it, the reptilian bloodlines would lack a mechanism. With it, the entire modern world becomes an expression of ancient continuity. In this system, nothing is random. Nothing is accidental. Every crisis becomes a potential stepping stone towards centralized control. And once that premise is accepted, the news ceases to be information. It becomes confirmation. Chapter 6: The Saturn-Moon Matrix. As David Icke's cosmology expanded in the 2000s, it moved beyond hidden bloodlines and secret societies into something far more sweeping. Control, he argued, was not only political or genetic. It was perceptual. Humanity, in his framework, does not merely live under manipulated governments. It lives inside a manipulated reality. Central to this phase of his theory is Saturn. Icke proposes that Saturn functions as a broadcasting station, emitting a powerful frequency signal that shapes human perception. He points to Saturn's persistent symbolism in ancient cultures, its hexagonal storm at the North Pole discovered by the Voyager missions and later photographed by the Cassini spacecraft, and the recurrence of cube iconography in religious and corporate architecture. To Icke, these are not aesthetic coincidences. They are encoded references to an ancient knowledge of Saturn's role in projecting what he calls the matrix reality. In this model, Saturn transmits a signal that is amplified or relayed by the Moon. Icke frequently suggests that the Moon itself may not be a natural celestial body. He cites its unusual size relative to Earth, its near-perfect positioning to create total solar eclipses, and seismic data from Apollo missions that describe the moon ringing like a bell after impact experiments. These anomalies, in his interpretation, imply artificial construction or modification. The moon becomes a signal booster, stabilizing the frequency field that locks human perception into a narrow bandwidth. What does that mean in practical terms? According to Icke, human senses detect only a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. This is scientifically accurate. Where he diverges from mainstream physics is in asserting that this limited range is not a biological accident but an engineered constraint. The Saturn-Moon frequency field, he argues, acts as a prison bar, filtering reality so that humans perceive only a controlled slice of existence. Beyond that slice, other entities, including the reptilian consciousness he describes, operate freely. In this framework, reality is holographic. Matter is not solid in the way it appears. It is a waveform decoded by the brain into the illusion of solidity. Icke often references quantum physics, particularly experiments demonstrating wave-particle duality and observer effects, to support the idea that perception shapes experience. He extends these findings into a far broader claim: the entire experiential world is a frequency construct that can be hijacked. Emotions become critical within this system. Icke argues that fear, trauma, and chronic stress lower human vibrational states, making individuals more susceptible to the control signal. Media saturation with violence, economic anxiety, and division is not merely political strategy. It is energetic farming. The more humanity remains in fear, the more tightly the frequency prison holds. Critics note that this synthesis blends legitimate scientific terminology with speculative leaps that lack empirical grounding. The hexagon on Saturn has atmospheric explanations. The moon's formation is widely theorized through the giant impact hypothesis. Quantum physics does not imply cosmic manipulation. Yet Icke's presentation stitches these elements together into a narrative that feels technologically mythic. Ancient gods become extraterrestrial engineers. Modern astrophysics becomes hidden testimony. What distinguishes the Saturn-Moon matrix theory from earlier conspiracies is scale. It is no longer about who controls governments. It is about who controls existence itself. Elections, wars, banking systems, even reptilian bloodlines become secondary mechanisms within a deeper enclosure. The ultimate prison is perception. Within this worldview, awakening does not mean voting differently or exposing corruption. It means breaking the frequency lock, expanding consciousness beyond the imposed bandwidth, seeing through the hologram. And once that premise is accepted, the sky itself becomes suspect. Chapter 7: Problem, Reaction, Solution. If the Saturn-Moon matrix explains the metaphysical cage in David Icke's cosmology, then problem, reaction, solution explains how that cage is tightened in practical terms. This phrase has become one of his most repeated formulations, a three-step pattern he argues underlies modern political and social change. According to Icke, global elites do not simply respond to crises. They manufacture or manipulate them. The public reacts emotionally. The same power structure then offers a pre-planned solution that expands control. What appears to be chaos is, in this framework, choreography. Icke applies this model across decades of modern history. Financial crashes, he argues, are not purely the result of market speculation or systemic miscalculation. They are engineered collapses designed to consolidate wealth upward and justify greater centralization of banking authority. The 2008 financial crisis, for example, is cited in his lectures as a moment when reckless lending practices created economic devastation, public outrage followed, and the ultimate solution involved massive bailouts that strengthened the very institutions at the center of the collapse. In his view, the pattern is not failure corrected by reform. It is crisis used as leverage. Terrorism occupies a similar place in this framework. Icke has repeatedly argued that major terror events are either facilitated, allowed to occur, or directly orchestrated by elements within intelligence agencies. The public reaction, fear and a demand for security, becomes the fuel for expanded surveillance powers, emergency legislation, and military intervention. Airport security intensifies. Digital monitoring increases. Civil liberties contract incrementally. Each step is framed as necessary for protection. In his narrative, protection is the pretext, not the purpose. Public health emergencies are interpreted through the same lens. Icke claims that pandemics, or the policies surrounding them, can function as accelerators toward centralized authority. Lockdowns, vaccine passports, digital identification systems, and biometric tracking are described as stepping stones toward a technocratic control grid. He frequently links these developments to proposals from international bodies such as the World Economic Forum, interpreting language about global coordination and digital infrastructure as evidence of long-term planning rather than reactive governance. Media plays a central role in amplifying the reaction phase. Icke argues that 24-hour news cycles saturate audiences with emotionally charged imagery and narratives, keeping populations in heightened states of anxiety. Fear narrows perception, he claims, making people more likely to accept sweeping solutions they might otherwise question. The repetition of messaging across multiple outlets creates the illusion of consensus. Dissenting voices are marginalized not necessarily through overt censorship alone, but through framing and prioritization. Critics counter that this model oversimplifies complex global systems and assumes intentional coordination where institutional inertia, competing interests, and genuine uncertainty often dominate. They argue that large-scale conspiracies would require levels of secrecy and coherence that are historically difficult to maintain. Yet the appeal of the problem, reaction, solution framework lies in its elegance. It reduces sprawling geopolitical events into a recognizable pattern. Once someone internalizes the pattern, every headline becomes evidence. Each crisis slots neatly into the triad. Within Icke's broader cosmology, this mechanism operates inside the Saturn-Moon frequency prison and under the guidance of the Babylonian Brotherhood. It is the day-to-day tactic of a much older agenda. The ultimate goal, he argues, is a fully centralized global system in which economic transactions, communication, travel, and identity are digitally monitored and controlled. A world government is not presented as a dramatic coup but as the cumulative outcome of incremental responses to manufactured emergencies. The power of this theory is psychological as much as political. It transforms uncertainty into intention. It assures the believer that nothing is random, that confusion itself is part of the design. In a world that often feels unstable and unpredictable, the idea that someone is steering the chaos can paradoxically feel stabilizing. Even if the steering hand is sinister, it is at least coherent. And in that coherence, the pattern begins to replicate itself. Chapter 8: The Backlash and Ban. As David Icke's theories spread through books, lecture tours, DVDs, and eventually the Internet, the backlash intensified in equal measure. What had once been national ridicule in the United Kingdom evolved into something more serious and more polarized. He was no longer simply viewed as eccentric. He was increasingly framed as dangerous. The debate shifted from whether his ideas were strange to whether they were harmful. One of the central controversies surrounding Icke involves the overlap between his reptilian bloodline theory and long-standing anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes. Critics argue that narratives about secret banking families controlling global finance echo historical myths that have fueled discrimination and violence for centuries. Although Icke insists that he is speaking about interdimensional entities rather than ethnic or religious groups, the proximity between the language of hidden bloodlines and older propaganda has generated sustained condemnation from watchdog organizations and scholars of extremism. They argue that even if unintended, such narratives can reinforce existing prejudices by providing a modernized mythic frame. Icke has repeatedly denied anti-Semitism, stating in interviews and lectures that he opposes all forms of racism and that his focus is on non-human consciousness manipulating humanity. He argues that critics intentionally conflate his claims with historical bigotry to discredit him. In his telling, accusations function as another example of suppression, a reputational weapon used by the very control systems he describes. This dynamic has created a feedback loop in which criticism becomes further proof of conspiracy. The rise of social media amplified both his reach and the response to it. By the 2010s, Icke's videos and interviews were circulating widely online, often accumulating millions of views. He appeared on alternative media platforms, podcasts, and independent streaming channels. His lectures, sometimes lasting 8 to 10 hours, drew large audiences in Europe, North America, and Australia. At the same time, technology companies began tightening policies around misinformation and harmful content. Following global crises, including acts of terrorism and public health emergencies, Icke's interpretations drew heightened scrutiny. Several major platforms removed his accounts, citing violations of policies related to misinformation or hate speech. YouTube terminated channels hosting his content. Facebook restricted distribution of his posts. Twitter suspended accounts associated with him. Payment processors and ticketing services occasionally cancelled events linked to his appearances. In some countries, including parts of Europe, speaking venues withdrew invitations under pressure from local authorities. Supporters interpreted these actions as confirmation of his central thesis. If powerful institutions were working to silence him, they argued, it was because he threatened entrenched interests. Bans became badges of authenticity. Clips of deplatforming announcements circulated as evidence that the system he described was real and defensive. Critics, meanwhile, maintained that platforms have an obligation to limit content that could mislead or inflame. To them, moderation was not persecution but harm reduction. Governments also entered the conversation. In certain instances, Icke faced travel restrictions or public order concerns related to scheduled events. Officials cited fears that his speeches could incite unrest or spread destabilizing narratives. Civil liberties advocates countered that restricting speech, even controversial speech, raises its own dangers. The tension between free expression and perceived social harm became part of his story. What emerged from this clash was not silence but fragmentation. As mainstream platforms closed doors, alternative ecosystems flourished. Subscription-based video sites, encrypted messaging channels, and independent publishing networks allowed Icke's material to circulate beyond traditional gatekeepers. The information landscape became more decentralized and more polarized. Those inclined to distrust institutions saw validation in every ban. Those concerned about misinformation saw necessary containment. Within Icke's cosmology, the backlash fits seamlessly. A system that controls perception would inevitably attempt to marginalize voices challenging it. Each removed video becomes part of the narrative. Each cancelled venue becomes a footnote in a larger argument about suppression. The conflict itself becomes content. In the end, the bans did not erase his presence. They altered its shape. David Icke remains a figure suspended between dismissal and devotion, between accusations of harm and claims of censorship. The backlash has become as integral to his identity as the theories themselves, reinforcing the division that keeps his name circulating in cycles of controversy and belief. Chapter 9: Why it Resonates. For many observers, the obvious question is not whether David Icke's theories are true, but why they endure. Reptilian bloodlines. Saturn broadcasting signals. A frequency prison wrapped around human perception. These are claims that depart radically from mainstream science and history. And yet, decades after his televised humiliation, Icke continues to attract audiences across continents. The durability of his cosmology demands examination. Part of the answer lies in institutional distrust. Over the past half-century, governments have been caught in documented deception. Intelligence agencies have concealed operations. Corporations have hidden data about environmental and health risks. Financial institutions have collapsed after reckless speculation while executives escaped severe consequences. These events are factual and recorded. When trust erodes repeatedly, alternative explanations gain oxygen. A theory that once sounded implausible can begin to feel like an exaggerated extension of confirmed corruption. Icke's framework also offers coherence. The modern world is complex to the point of cognitive overload. Global supply chains, algorithmic media feeds, multinational trade agreements, opaque financial instruments. It is difficult for any individual to track how decisions ripple across systems. Conspiracy cosmologies simplify this chaos. Instead of thousands of interacting variables, there is a central directing force. Instead of uncertainty, there is intention. Human psychology often prefers a structured villain to impersonal randomness. There is also narrative appeal. Icke does not merely present data points. He tells a story. Ancient beings. Hidden bloodlines. A cosmic prison. An awakening. It is mythic in scale. Myths have always served as frameworks for understanding forces beyond ordinary perception. In earlier eras, those myths involved gods and demons shaping fate. In a technological age, the same archetypes reappear with new vocabulary. Interdimensional entities replace devils. Frequency fields replace curses. The structure remains familiar. The Internet accelerated this resonance. Prior to digital networks, fringe ideas struggled to find mass audiences. Distribution was limited by printing costs and broadcasting gatekeepers. Online platforms erased many of those barriers. Individuals seeking alternative narratives could find entire communities that reinforced and expanded them. Algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, often promote emotionally charged content. The more dramatic the claim, the more it circulates. Icke's sweeping cosmology fits naturally into this environment. Another factor is empowerment. Icke repeatedly encourages listeners to question authority and think independently. For some, adopting his worldview feels like reclaiming agency. Instead of being passive consumers of news, they become investigators decoding hidden patterns. The sense of insider knowledge can be psychologically potent. It transforms the believer from spectator to participant in a larger revelation. Critics argue that this empowerment is illusory, that replacing institutional narratives with an all-encompassing conspiracy does not restore agency but relocates it into an even more totalizing system. If reptilian entities and frequency grids control everything, individual action appears limited. Yet within Icke's teachings, there is always an escape clause. Raise your consciousness. Reject fear. Expand perception. The prison is energetic, not absolute. Ultimately, the persistence of Icke's ideas reveals as much about the cultural moment as about the man himself. We live in an era defined by information abundance and trust scarcity. Data floods every screen, but confidence in institutions declines. In that environment, comprehensive alternative cosmologies thrive. They offer certainty in place of ambiguity, design in place of accident, and a hidden architecture behind visible events. Whether one views David Icke as deluded, dangerous, symbolic, or prophetic, the resonance of his narrative cannot be dismissed as simple eccentricity. It taps into enduring psychological needs and modern anxieties. And as long as those needs remain unmet by conventional explanations, the space for sweeping mythologies will remain open. Chapter 10: The Mythmaker. After decades of lectures, bans, ridicule, sold-out theaters, and marathon books, David Icke occupies a peculiar cultural space. He is too persistent to dismiss as a footnote, too controversial to normalize, too elaborate to ignore. Whether one views him as visionary, fabulist, or architect of a modern mythology, he has undeniably constructed one of the most expansive conspiracy cosmologies of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. What distinguishes Icke from many contemporaries is scale. He does not merely critique governments or question official narratives. He offers a total system. Biology, finance, media, religion, astrophysics, and quantum theory all fit within his structure. The reptilian bloodlines explain inherited power. The Babylonian Brotherhood explains institutional coordination. The Saturn-Moon matrix explains perceptual limitation. Problem, reaction, solution explains crisis management. Each component interlocks. Remove one, and the others compensate. This structural completeness is part of the appeal. Comprehensive systems are psychologically stabilizing. They reduce ambiguity. They promise that behind confusion lies design. For some, this is empowering. For others, it is claustrophobic. In Icke's world, randomness barely exists. Coincidence dissolves into orchestration. Even opposition becomes part of the machinery. There is also something archetypal about his role. Throughout history, there have been figures who claim to see behind the veil of consensus reality. Gnostics spoke of hidden archons manipulating the material world. Medieval mystics described unseen hierarchies influencing earthly events. Modern science fiction imagines simulated universes and masked overlords. Icke sits somewhere at the crossroads of these traditions. He speaks in the language of spirituality, conspiracy, and technology simultaneously. Ancient serpent myths become interdimensional entities. Religious awakening becomes frequency expansion. The apocalypse becomes administrative. Critics argue that such sweeping narratives risk flattening real-world complexity and can blur into harmful territory when they echo older prejudices or undermine trust in shared institutions. Supporters argue that questioning entrenched systems is necessary and that institutional power has repeatedly proven itself capable of deception. The divide remains sharp, and perhaps that divide is itself emblematic of the era. In an age defined by digital fragmentation, information abundance, and eroding consensus, myth re-emerges in technological clothing. The gods are no longer on mountaintops. They are behind screens, in boardrooms, in orbital configurations. The dragons are no longer in caves. They are in bloodlines and bandwidths. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories reflect a profound unease about power and perception. David Icke did not invent distrust. He did not invent serpent symbolism or elite conspiracy narratives. What he did was assemble them into a single, cohesive myth for the Internet age. He offered a cosmology at a time when traditional cosmologies were weakening. For some, that myth fills a vacuum. For others, it deepens the fracture. Perhaps the most enduring element of his story is not whether reptilian entities walk among us or whether Saturn broadcasts a control signal. It is the reminder that humans have always searched for hidden architecture behind visible events. When the world feels unstable, we look for structure. When power feels distant, we look for faces behind it. When reality feels filtered, we ask who built the filter. The strange part is not that one man built an elaborate theory. The strange part is how many people found in it a mirror of their own suspicion that something larger was at work. This has been Strange, and on our next episode we will be looking at One Man Out of Time. Maybe we'll look into the story of John Titor.